Hey guys, very excited to be back for another podcast episode about Donald Trump's The Art of the Deal, Chapter 5, The Move to Manhattan. So, in this chapter, we're going to explore Trump's move to the city and what he did to get known and to win his first deals. He says, I had my eye on Manhattan from the time I graduated from Wharton in 1968. But at that point, the market in the city was very hot. The prices seemed very high, and I was unable to find a deal I liked, meaning a good piece of property at a price I found affordable. Trump was very patient with the deals he made. He only bought when he thought the price was fair, or more frankly, that he had an advantage. So he said that although his father was very successful, he didn't believe in giving much to his kids. And so when Trump graduated from college, he had a net worth of $200,000, and it was mostly tied up in buildings in Brooklyn and Queens. He wanted to help his father's business, but he wanted to go to Manhattan at the same time. So he went out to rent an apartment, a studio on 3rd Avenue and 75th Street in 1971. And he said he looked out on the water tank in the court of the adjacent building. I jokingly referred to my apartment as a penthouse because it did happen to be near the top floor of the building. I also tried to divide it up so that it would seem bigger, but no matter what I did, it was still a dark, dingy little apartment. Even so, I loved it. Moving into that apartment was probably more exciting for me than moving 15 years later to the top 3 floors of Trump Tower on 5th Avenue and 57th Street, overlooking Central Park. You have to understand, I was a kid from Queens who worked in Brooklyn, and suddenly I had an apartment on the Upper East Side. So his family operated in Brooklyn and Queens, and now he was going to take the lead and go conquer Manhattan. So he continues. The really important thing was that by virtue of this move, I became much more familiar with Manhattan. I began to walk the streets in a way you never do if you just come in to visit or do business. I got to know all the good properties. I became a city guy instead of a kid from the boroughs. As far as I was concerned, I had the best of all worlds. I was young and I had a lot of energy, and I was living in Manhattan, even though I commuted back to Brooklyn to work. Then one of the first thing he did was to join Le Club, which was one of the most exclusive clubs in the city, private clubs, and it was located on East 54th Street. And basically, it was full, as he says, of very successful men and beautiful women and just extremely successful people from all walks of life. The way he tried to join showed how relentless and driven he was. He says, I'll never forget how I became a member. One day I called up Le Club and I said, my name is Donald Trump and I'd like to join your club. The guy on the other end of the phone just laughed and said, you've got to be kidding. Nobody, of course, had heard of me. The next day I got another idea and I called back and I said to the guy, listen, could I have a list of your members? I may know someone who is a member. And he said, I'm sorry, we don't do that. And he hung up. The next day, I called again and said, I need to reach the president of the club. I want to send him something. For some reason, the guy gave me the president's name and his business number, and I called him up. I introduced myself and I said, very politely, my name is Donald Trump, and I'd like to join the club. And he said, do you have any friends or family in the club? And I said, no, I don't know anybody there. He said, well, what makes you think you should be admitted as a member? I just kept talking and talking, and finally this fellow said to me, I'll tell you what, you sound like a nice young man, and maybe it would be good to have some younger members, so why don't you meet me for a drink at 21? So here we just see Trump manages to, again, he takes a shortcut by contacting the president of the club directly. So it doesn't work to contact the people that are at the operational level. If you go straight to the top, you have a better chance at getting what he needed was an exception. Of course, he didn't know anyone. He wasn't well known then. A decent net worth, but nothing of the scale, that would automatically grant him acceptance. And through perseverance, he got in. He says, the next night we met for a drink. There was just one small problem. I don't drink, and I'm not very big on sitting around. And he says, I have a father who has always been a rock, very straight and very solid. My father would come home every night at 7, have his dinner, read the newspaper, watch the news, and that was that. And I'm as much of a rock as my father. So again, he lauds his father for his discipline and his soberness. Also, you have to remember Trump lost a brother to alcoholism, so he stays away from alcohol. If that was the case, that everyone around him drank a lot, I was going to have a big advantage, right? Because Trump stays sober while all the other people indulge and weaken their faculties. So Tr- Trump regrets that eventually all the people he was with drank too much and they didn't remember the next day when he called the president. He had to kind of start from scratch. Anyways, eventually, as promised, he was admitted to the club, and it turned out to be a great move for him socially and professionally. Okay, so continuing, Trump is going to refer also to his mother and to his wife as rocks, as anchors, meaning people very solid like his father. So he's going to congratulate his father and mother for having celebrated 50 years of marriage, and also his wife for being a reliable partner. And that, he says, is in contrast with the people that he saw at the club who seemed to have less stable relationships. And then eventually he meets the legendary lawyer, Roy Cohn. He doesn't like how most lawyers love to take settlements because, of course, settlements means less work, less efforts, less fighting, less risk, and immediate payout for the lawyers and their clients, but usually for much less than they could make concessions. So Trump finds someone who agrees with him. Cohn agrees completely that settlements are subpar, should not be the default. And where Cohn does ask Trump, is this just an academic discussion, as in we're going to talk business, or are you going to hire me for a specific job, or what? And eventually, well, Trump tells him that some lawsuits against his father's company that he wants Roy Cohn's help for. So they start working together. And he says, I learned a lot about Roy during that period. He was a great lawyer when he wanted to be. He could go into a case without any notes. He had a photographic memory and could argue the facts from his head. When he was prepared, he was brilliant and almost unbeatable. However, he wasn't always prepared. Even then, he was so brilliant that he could sometimes get away with it. Unfortunately, he could also be a disaster. And so I would always question Roy very closely before a court date. If he wasn't prepared, I'd push for postponement. So yeah, while Trump knew how to handle someone like Roy Cohn, who could be excellent when prepared, but less so when not prepared, and Trump had the flair to detect whether he had prepared or not. Then he says, tough as he was, Roy always had a lot of friends, and I'm not embarrassed to say I was one. He was a truly loyal guy. It was a matter of honor with him. And because he was also very smart, he was a great guy to have on your side. You could count on him to go to bat for you, even if he privately disagreed with your view. And even if defending you wasn't necessarily the best thing for him, he was never two-faced. Just compare that with all the hundreds of quote unquote respectable guys who make careers out of boasting about their uncompromising integrity, but have absolutely no loyalty. They think only about what's best for them and don't think twice about stabbing a friend in the back if the friend becomes a problem. What I like most about Roy Cohn was that he would do just the opposite. Roy was the sort of guy who would be there at your hospital bed long after everyone else had bailed out, literally standing by you to the death. So Trump has a lot of praise for Roy Cohn. And again, Trump highlights the importance of loyalty in business and personal relationships. Eventually, he got an opportunity because in 1973, things began to turn bad in Manhattan. He says, I'd always assumed the market would cool off because everything runs in cycles, and real estate is no different. Even so, I never expected things to get as bad as they did. It was a combination of factors. First, the federal government announced a moratorium on housing subsidies. Second, interest rates began to rise. And third, there was a spurt of inflation, particularly in construction costs. And then the biggest problem was that the city's debts were rising, and there were rumors that New York for defaults, and it issued much fewer building permits. So the appetite to build was not there, and Trump saw that as an opportunity. Here he says a very interesting quote. I worry about the future of New York City too, but I can't say it kept me up at nights. I'm basically an optimist, and frankly, I saw the city's trouble as a great opportunity for me. Because I grew up in Queens, I believed, perhaps to an irrational degree, that Manhattan was always going to be the best place to live, the center of the world. whatever troubles the city might be having in the short term, there was no doubt in my mind that things had to turn around ultimately. What other city was going to take New York's place? And so, with Trump's optimism and flair for opportunity, he approached a certain Victor Palmieri, who had been in charge of helping Penn Central Railroad with their bankruptcy and who had control of certain assets that Trump was interested in developing. He said, "Hello, my name is Donald Trump, and I like to buy the 60th Street Yards. The simplest approach is often the most effective. I think they liked my directness and enthusiasm. I hadn't built anything yet, but what I did have was the willingness to go after things that people in a better position than mine wouldn't have considered seeking." And here Trump gives us a bit of a master class on if you're interested in buying a property, what you should do. So there's 3 steps. If you want to buy something, it's obviously in your best interest to convince the seller that what he's got isn't worth very much. Number 2, the second thing I told Victor was how incredibly hard it was going to be politically to get zoning approvals for such a big piece of undeveloped land. I pointed out that the community board would fight any development and that the process of going before the city planning commission, the board of estimate, would be endless. The third thing I did, and probably the most important, was to sell myself to Victor and his people. I couldn't sell him on my experience or my accomplishment, so instead I sold him on my energy and my enthusiasm. So to recap, he's telling him what he has isn't worth very much. It's going to be very hard to exploit or develop given the regulatory challenges. And third, he's convincing him that he's the best man on the job with his energy and enthusiasm. So this is the birth of the Trump Organization. Trump says that he works for the Trump Organization, even though they were just a few people working out of Brooklyn at that time. And eventually they begin to work together. So he says, by building a close relationship with Victor from the start, I was able, in effect, to work for him rather than just be another buyer. That was terrific for me. And he's going to explain what he got out of it. For example, we drew up agreements giving me an exclusive option to purchase the 60th Street and 30th Street yards, but subject to zoning, subject to approval by the court handling the Penn Central bankruptcy, subject to everything except my having to put up any money. That's very interesting. So Trump gets exclusive rights without having to put down any money, which is just brilliant negotiation. Eventually, with that option, he can go see the banks and see other backers and raise the money. And so it truly is something that works in his favor to get an early advantage to go get the financing. Trump says he loves to minimize the downside and the upside will take care of itself. So here's an example. He's not putting any money down. He gets an exclusive option and then he'll try to make it happen. So here he says, Palmieri in turn helped give me credibility with the press. When he was asked by a reporter from Barron's why he chose Trump over others, he said, those properties were nothing but a black hole of undefinable risk. We interviewed all kinds of people who were interested in them, none of whom had what seemed like the kind of drive, backing, and imagination that would be necessary. Until the young guy Trump came along. He's almost a throwback to the 19th century as a promoter. He's larger than life. So Trump enjoys his praise, but at the same time, he hears criticism from one of his close friends that says that Trump has a great line of shit, but where are the bricks and mortar? So basically saying that he's all talk and no action. So Trump was outraged, says he's outraged by hearing that. And he didn't speak to the guy for a year, but then he sort of thought it through and said, yeah, the guy's right. Like, if he doesn't deliver the merchandise in, soon, then yeah, his entire spiel can be called as a bluff. He said he can do it. He hasn't done it yet, but the only way to prove that he can do it is by doing it, and he will. So that gives him a boost. His reputation hinges on execution, not just on promises, which is important. Eventually, as soon as he makes his announcements public, he says other bidders suddenly came out of the woodwork. Started Housing, for example, a company we're partners with on the Starrett City housing project in Brooklyn, made a bid for $150 million. contingent on financing and city approvals and all the rest. On the face of it, their bid was a lot higher than mine. So Trump's bid was for 62 million, and here we have a company coming in at 150 million. But Trump here is gonna double down on putting the deals of others down and making light shine on his. I'm the first to admit that I'm very competitive and that I'll do nearly anything within legal bounds to win. Sometimes part of making a deal is denigrating your competition. In this case, I happen to genuinely believe that the started bid wasn't legitimate, that the company would never close the deal and would not be able to successfully develop the site, even if the deal did go through. The fact is that anyone can bid anything, particularly when there are all sorts of contingencies. The same thing could be said about my bid, except that by then I'd put in enough time and effort to have convinced Palmieri's people that I was very serious and very committed. In the end, I managed to convince Palmieri that it made more sense to stick with my $62 million bid than to take a flyer on Starrett. And then, unfortunately, he says, the irony is that less than a year after I announced my plans for the site and beat my competition, the economic situation in New York City turned from bad to much worse. And then he details the whole process for choosing the convention sites, and there's lengthy back and forths eventually until the mayor leaves office. It's still in the air, and eventually it's when Ed Koch becomes mayor that it finally gets. Trump wants to be the builder of the convention, but is being told that he cannot because of conflicts of interest. Eventually, they took much longer to build the convention center. They built it over budget. He says that by the time the convention center was finally finished last year, it was 4 years behind schedule and at least 250 million over budget. When you add interest, the carrying cost for all those years of construction, the total cost was probably 1 billion or 700 million over budget. The construction was a terrible disgrace, and all the worse because no one raised a fuss about it. Here's a very Trump trait that we're going to read. When I was invited to attend opening day ceremonies in 1986, I refused. What happened at the convention center is that the city and state took a great piece of property and a great project and ruined it through terrible planning and ridiculous cost overruns. Even if the convention center is ultimately a success, it can never earn back all the money that was unnecessarily squandered to build it. So here we see that Trump, of course, is vindictive, of course, keeps tabs, and is upset that he was sidelined. He sees that they made a lot of mistakes. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I encourage you to respect yourselves and make yourself respected by giving your presence only to people and causes that respect you in return. Thanks for listening.